Welcome to FFRF's Ask an Atheist. I'm Chris Line, a staff attorney at FFRF, and I'm coming to you live from the Stephen Uhl Friendly Atheist Studio in Freethought Hall, FFRF's headquarters in Madison, Wisconsin.
And I'm Mark Dan, FFRF Director of Governmental Affairs based in Washington, D.C. Today on Ask an Atheism, we have Leaving Mormonism and Right-Wing Politics. We're going to talk with Matthew Sheffield, a national correspondent for TYT and host of the podcast Theory of Change. Before leaving right-wing media, Matthew ran a marketing and technology company which catered to Republican campaigns, organizations, and publications. He is credited with the campaign to get Dan Rather fired, and then went on to create other right-wing information sites such as NewsBusters. He became the founding online managing editor of the Washington Examiner and a conservative newspaper. He grew up in a far-right Mormon household and is now a non-believer. We'll talk with Matthew about his journey out of right-wing politics and Mormonism and into progressive media and developing his identity as a non-believer. You can find Matthew on Twitter at Matt Sheffield. Matthew, we're honored to have you.
Thanks. Good to be here.
If you have any questions for Matthew during today's show, you can ask them in the comments or send an email to askanatheist@ffrf.org. Now, the show is called Ask an Atheist, but today we also have a question for you, the viewer. Given the results of the 2022 election, do you think Christian nationalism suffered a tremendous setback? Put your answer in the comments and we'll try to read them over the air, provided it's family-friendly.
And remember, FFRF is a 501c3 nonpartisan organization, so we do not and cannot take sides in partisan elections and don't necessarily endorse any such views that might be expressed here.
Before we get talking about your growing up as a fundamentalist Mormon, in a fundamentalist Mormon household, and your experience in right-wing politics, we'd like to get your impression about the 2022 midterms. Given that numerous election-denying secretaries of state candidates, as well as Christian nationalist stalwarts such as Kari Lake in Arizona and Doug Mastriano in Pennsylvania lost their elections, do you think Christian nationalism is on its back foot? Or do you think right-wing activists are going to double down on Christian nationalism?
Well, there's no question that they experienced some significant setbacks in the election. Across the board, all their most controversial, high-profile candidates lost. And it's important to take stock of that fact because the reality is that the majority of Americans, religious or otherwise, are not interested in Christian supremacism. And, while the term Christian nationalism is useful, I actually prefer the term Christian supremacist because that's what they want. They want to impose this sort of Confederate-style Christianity on the rest of people. And if you happen to be of a, no faith or a non-Christian faith or a Christian who doesn't believe in this type of Christianity, then they don't care. They want dictatorship, in fact. In fact, one of their advocates actually reacted to that, this guy named Nick Fuentes, who is a white nationalist. He literally said after the election that, look, this is why we need dictatorship. We're in a minority. So the smarter ones among them, they know this, and they are not going to stop. Basically, their goal is to try to, divide elections up into small chunks so that they can use their fanatically motivated base to, win these elections without majority support. They don't care about majorities.
So given your experience with right-wing politics, if you were sitting in their strategy sessions, what are they doing now after the disappointing midterms?
Well, I definitely did sit in sessions like that. And one of the things that they are doing is that, they are telling themselves that they are God's servants. That's the core of their identity. And it's something that I think a lot of people who haven't had direct contact with this extreme religious fundamentalism, it's hard to believe that people could actually think that they're God's personal servants, but they actually do believe that. And so for them, it's not just that, because I think a lot of people are aware of some of these, conspiracy theories like QAnon about how various, imaginary Satan worshipers rule the world, et cetera. But the flip side of that also is that they are God's personal servants. And that is a kind of extremism that I think a lot of Americans, it's uncomfortable for them to contemplate that, because they want to see it as something that only Muslims would do. But the reality is that this fanaticism exists in all religions, fundamentalist religions.
So sometimes, as we've seen with religious politics and whatnot, and sometimes as we're seeing things emerge about Christian nationalism, is this more about obtaining and holding power, or is it about pursuing a religious doctrine, or is it a little bit of both? Or is it just it's just we want to pursue power, and religion just happens to be a nice vehicle to get that and obtain power and hold power?
Well, I think it depends on the person that you're looking at. In general, it is a mix of all of these things. So there are, for instance, plenty of, actually, unfortunately, there are, some number of people who have this, who are non-religious, who have decided that they want to enable and empower Christian supremacists, like the billionaire Peter Thiel, who is, emphatically said he's non-believer, he's gay. So like in the world that these people, that the Christian supremacists want to make, he's someone that they'll put up against the wall. But for him, he thinks that he has enough money that he can insulate himself from that. And he wants to impose this sort of market fundamentalist, which is what I call it, viewpoint on the rest of society. And so he sees, some fellow extremists, and he doesn't care that they have a religious fanaticism that he knows is faulty and irrational. So for him, it's about power, and there are people like him that have that viewpoint. But, for others of them, one of the things that was interesting to me when I would sit in some of these strategy meetings is that they would pursue strategies that they knew wouldn't work. And I was in them, and I would tell them, most one that I'm thinking of right now was there was this, they were going to try to shut down the government for some, because they wanted to force spending cuts. And, whatever, if that's what your opinion is on the budget, I mean, that's not germane to this discussion. But I said to them, look, this isn't going to work. People have tried this a number of years, a number of times over the years. It never works. Anytime anyone from either party does this sort of thing, it never works. So why are we wasting our time with this? And they said, well, this is the hill we want to die on. And that was a phrase that I heard a disturbing number of times. This is a hill we will have to die on. And they would say it over and over. And and again, like this disturbing extremism, people, again, if you haven't seen it yourself personally, it's not real. Like, this is something that exists in the movies, and for a lot of people, especially if you grew up, in a more secular, tolerant area, that it's not real to you. It's imaginary. It's just a cartoon almost. But like, that's what they really think. And in fact, if you look at this woman who was Donald Trump's press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, she wrote an entire book in which was predicated on the fantasy that people wanted to kill her because she was a Christian. And that was and it grew out of, so there was this myth that grew out of that came out of the first mass school shooting in the United States, the Columbine High School in Colorado. There was an urban legend that came out of there that one of the students who was attending was asked by one of the shooters, "Are you a Christian?" And she boldly confessed that she was, and then he shot her. Wow. But the reality is that incident never happened. And she wasn't asked if she was Christian, and he did not shoot her because she was Christian. But there's this enormous fantasy of of dying for Jesus. Like this is in the right-wing imagination, this is their goal almost, and it's really not that different from the way that you see jihadists in Islam glorify people willing to blow themselves up, and it's this line of thinking it's so pervasive, and in fact, one of Trump's lawyers, well, I guess she's his former lawyer now. She is with this far right Christian legal group. Jenna Ellis is her name, and she has, last time I checked on her Twitter profile, she has a pinned tweet on her Twitter profile that says, "If they try to cancel Christianity, I won't let them. I will stand firm upon the rock of Christ, no matter what they do to me." And like this, they really do actually want to, they fantasize about dying for Jesus.
So what's
and
the
it's
connection
disturbing.
between shutting down the government and government shutdowns and dying for Jesus? Help me understand that a little bit more.
Yeah, well, they're not, okay, so they're not obviously directly related, right?
Right.
But it is, they are psychologically related. So it is the mentality of that. It's if we lose, then we've won. And it's something that you see if you take the kind of literalist, and it's a weird interpretation that they've settled upon, because the earliest ancient Christians had this idea that they were going to lose, and that this was Jesus's kingdom was not of this world, and that they would lose on earth but win in heaven. But now today's extremist American Christians have kind of flipped this on its head, where they fantasize about losing, but they also are trying to impose their opinions on everyone else. And so that's one of the things that I saw, is that they would pursue ideas and strategies that were destructive, were doomed to fail, but they made them feel good, that it fed their thanatos, their death drive. And there's a book, there's a whole series of novels out there that kind of really play into this, that have tickled the evangelical imagination so immensely. It's called This Present Darkness.
Okay.
And it's a series that it basically set it in many ways. It kind of prefigures the whole QAnon cult movement, where the series is set in this small college town, and in it there's an invisible battle between demons and angels over this particular town, because the demons are going to use it as the place to build the Antichrist, future world domination. And the humans in the town only belatedly become aware of this conflict. And this sense is, and the phrase "this present darkness" is coming from the book of First Thessalonians, I believe. And they believe that, like Satan in the fundamentalist Christian imagination plays probably a larger role in people's daily lives, certainly did in mine as a fundamentalist Mormon, than God.
Wow.
So you've kind of been touching on this, but how much of a threat is an increasingly secular and non-religious America to those in right-wing circles?
Oh, it is all they think about. So when a lot of the conventional political media, Washington reporters, they're secular people. They, in many cases, were born and raised that way, and so none of this is real to them. And they've come up with this idea that there are a lot of Americans who have economic anxiety, or have, who are populist, who want a populist party like Donald Trump. But of course, the reality is that the policies of Donald Trump are not actually populist. Like he made tax cuts that, were overwhelmingly given to the richest people in the United States, and he moved dramatically to decrease regulations on businesses and things like that. So these were not populist policies that he was enacting in terms of from an economic standpoint, as any person would expect the term populist to mean. What it is a form of cultural populism, or this idea that we cannot prove our ideas, but we will force them anyway. And there's it's basically they've come to the conclusion that nothing is true in society unless it is forced, and it's it's like a kind of a different spin on Mao Zedong's phrase that power flows from the barrel of a gun. Well, in their case, truth flows from the government bureaucracy.
Well, that's scary.
Truth flows from a fundamentalist bureaucracy, but not from a secular from a secular bureaucracy.
Well, from whoever controls it. So if presently it is controlled by, the demonic servants of Satan like you guys, and in their minds. So, but that's why. So, like, say if you listen to, Steve Bannon actually is a great. If you really want to know what these people believe, he's really a great proponent of what they think and how irrational and violent they are. I mean, Steve Bannon, he said during the COVID-19 pandemic that he wanted to cut off the head of Anthony Fauci and put it on a pike outside of the White House. He literally said that. And then and right after he said it, his podcast co-host, he said, the other day it was the anniversary of some Tories who were hanging out with the British after they took over Boston. And well, once the revolutionaries got back control of it, they hung those Tories. And Steve Bannon was like, yep, that's what we used to do to traitors. And like, this is, again, like people, it's hard emotionally, for those of us who don't share these opinions to contemplate this level of extremism. But this is actually what they think.
So, in other words, this has nothing to do with tax cuts or anything like that. That's just kind of a nice thing, or China. This is really, would you say in right-wing politics, what's the more animating factor? Do you think it is more of these Christian nationalist topics, or do you think it's the forgotten group of Americans or China or whatnot?
Oh, it's definitely religious reaction. So, and you can see that, like, one of the things that I enjoy doing is sometimes I'll go and look on various Twitter profiles of Republican activists, and almost invariably, the very first thing they have on their description of themselves is Christian or believer. And like, they're telling you what their priority is and why they do this. And when you look at public opinion polls, so I mean, there's been a lot of, fortunately, scholars who are interested in this material have been finally allowed to pursue it, right. Because for a long time, universities were very censorial and cowardly about discussing Christian supremacism and extremism. But so now that some polls of this nature have come out, I mean, there's research that shows that when evangelicals, and this is, that's kind of like a handy sort of heuristic to think about it in this term, but it's certainly not just evangelicals. But when white evangelicals are asked, should the United States be a religion in which Christians have more rights? They say yes. And when you look at other things like that, when they ask, well, was the United States established to be a Christian nation? And they overwhelmingly say yes. And they overwhelmingly say that they want to remove all separation of church and state. I mean, Lauren Boebert, who is the representative of Colorado's 3rd district, right. And a fundamentalist Christian herself, has been saying before her election recently, she was explicitly saying this whole idea of church and state separation it's nonsense, and we need to get rid of it. It's time for us to wise up and put that in the trash can. So this is, and she's providing an idea that Charlie Kirk, who operates this organization called Turning Point USA, which is basically it's like a grooming factory. That's really what it is for young people, and they target grooming them for Christian nationalist extremism. And he says all the time about how the church and state separation should not exist. And then he had somebody on his podcast on election night as the returns were getting worse and worse for these extremist people. He had somebody who was on there named Benny Johnson, who is a Turning Point USA executive and popular Newsmax host and social media personality. He said that, we need to look at Florida as our model, a model of that we want someone who will destroy our enemies, who will make molten salty tears flow from their faces. That was his phrase for it. They don't care about, that was his phrase. Yeah. They don't care about policies or tax cuts anymore. All they care about is, can they make the atheists grovel? Can they put, LGBTQ people back in the closet? And can they make Black people know their place?
Wow.
Well, given all that, it'd be a good time to remind the audience that if you haven't already, be sure to answer our audience question from the top of the show, which was, given the results of the 2022 election, do you think Christian nationalism suffered a tremendous setback? And then, Matt, can you tell us a little about your career as a right-wing communications operative? What were your biggest accomplishments?
Sure. Well, so as you guys discussed in the meeting, I was born and raised in a extremist Mormon family, and as is often the case, people with very extreme religious views get into right-wing politics, and that was me. And so I was one of the. But as a Mormon, though, I never quite fit in with that worldview as much because, a lot of it is very evangelical driven. And especially in the 90s, there was a lot of resistance and hatred and bigotry against Mormons by white evangelicals. And so I didn't quite fit in with what they were doing, but nonetheless, I was still gravitating toward it because they were fundamentalists like I was. And so anyway, one of my brothers and I, we started a website. There was no word blog for it back then in 2000 called ratherbias.com. And it was basically dedicated to saying that Dan Rather of CBS News, who was the anchor of then, had a liberal bias in that we didn't like him. And it was one of the first blogs of its kind at that time. And we operated it off and on for a few years, and then became the first publication to find a typewriter, and that was basically we were involved with the document scandal where he put some fake documents on the air and claimed that they proved that George W. Bush had evaded the Vietnam War draft, and the reality is, of course, the fact that those documents were forged didn't mean that he didn't do that. It just meant those documents were fake. But anyway, so we got all kinds of press coverage as a result of that. And I, was on TV a number of times. And so after that, I decided to start a consulting firm to expand my interest beyond, because I was definitely sick of writing only about CBS News by that point. And so I started up a website called NewsBusters, which I began with this Christian supremacist group called the Media Research Center. And it was interesting because by that time, when I started the company, so one of my brothers and I, we started the company together and the site together. And we decided up until that point we had been working in our father's kind of informal, unauthorized Mormon ministry, and we decided we were tired of that and decided to move out and focus on Republican politics exclusively. And so after we moved out, we decided to move in together to be roommates. And our mom, after we had finished moving everything out, she gave us a paper and said, "Okay, here's the address of the local Mormon church, and here's what time they meet. You guys are going to go, right?" And we said, "Yeah, Mom, sure." And we intended to, in fact, but by that time. And we can talk about this maybe a little bit further on here, but we had both been kind of becoming disenchanted with the irrational belief system of Mormonism, or like just their practices. So like they have, for instance, congregations whose sole purpose is to get people married to each other, Mormons to marry each other. They call them singles wards. And they literally will kick you out of that congregation if you get married, or if you get past the age of 40, they don't want you there, and because they want the young single adults to marry each other. And I thought that was just kind of abhorrent and really patronizing. And so when the first Sunday came around, I got up in time and took a shower, and then I thought to myself, you know what, I don't want to go. And I went over to the other room where my brother was, and I said, "I don't want to go today. Do you?" And he said, "No." And we never went again. And it kind of set off, eventually our parents realized we were not going to church. We told them that we weren't. And they said, "Well, do you still believe in it? Do you still believe in it?" And I said, "Well, to be honest, I've never actually looked at the facts, whether this church is true or not." And so their incessant questioning of me about Mormonism led me to start researching it. And I realized, wow, my sources of information about Mormonism were extraordinarily biased, that everything that I knew about it came only from the Mormon hierarchy. And that's not the way that I approach politics. That, if I believed at that time that, journalism should be about, and I still do believe that if you want to figure out what's going on, you have to talk to everybody that's involved in it. And so if Mormonism is true, then you could talk to people or read their materials of people who were not Mormon and see what they thought about it. So I started doing that, and eventually, very rapidly began to realize, so this is not true at all. And all these little doubts that I had kind of, they all clicked. It was like I had been collecting little puzzle pieces of doubt my whole life. But I made sure I didn't want that to put them together. But then once I entertained the idea, well, what if it's not true? Then it was like all the pieces came together.
So how does it feel to be an apostate?
It's a lot better, I'll tell you that. I mean, being born and raised in fundamentalist extremist Mormonism, you are constantly living in fear. I mean, as a kid, I was, there's all kinds of scriptures that they encourage you to read and think about. They actually have a song that is about the second coming of Jesus and whether you will be worthy to live there. Right. And it's like you're literally contemplating your own death. Because for Mormons, they don't believe in the rapture. They believe that Jesus will come back and burn up all the wicked people, and then only the righteous will live. And so the belief that I was always worried about was, well, what if I'm not righteous enough? And because I just know that Jesus is going to come back while I'm alive. And it wasn't until I began looking, in early Mormon history documents that I realized, wow, these my fellow Mormons have been believing for over 150 years that Jesus was coming back in their lifetime. And so, once I realized that, it was such a weight off of my shoulders because, I could think for myself. I didn't have to forward ideas that other people had invented that didn't make sense to me. I didn't have to justify things that were hateful or stupid. I could decide for myself what I thought. So it's great.
So when you were working in right-wing communications and right-wing politics, when did you begin to realize what you were doing was a mistake? And how did that process evolve?
Sure. Well, so it kind of, to some degree, it was somewhat similar to my exit from Mormonism in that I knew that there were a lot of issues that I had with, that my colleagues had, but I chose not to look at them. So like I chose not to familiarize myself with some of these far right evangelical groups, et cetera, and not read what they were saying and read what they wanted. But eventually, after having created a number of different websites and publications, I decided, well, I think I know enough about politics now, and I have enough experience at this stuff that I'm going to write a book that is trying to encourage the Republican Party to be more tolerant of non-religious people and non-Christians, and that, in fact, conservatism as a philosophy is inherently secular, as a matter of fact, or at least it has a large secular component. So, such as like if you look at David Hume, who was the kind of most famous Enlightenment, non-religious philosopher. He was conservative, and you look at Montesquieu, who was non-religious, biggest influence on the American founders, James Madison. I don't have to tell your audience this, but like so many of the American founders were not Christians and explicitly, anti-miracle non-believers, and so that's what my book was about. It was presenting that history, presenting that philosophy. And then also presenting how these other, and so I began becoming familiar with some of these far right Christians, and it was horrifying to me. I had signed I had an agreement with a major publisher. They were really excited about it. My editor said my book was the best one he had seen in 20 years, and so I was really excited about it. But then, after I'd written, I think about 60 or 70,000 words, I realized what I'm writing here actually won't persuade my target audience because they believe that they're God's servants. And so I could tell them, well, this is the rational thing to do. This is what the polls say. You should, modify your political program to be more responsive to public opinion. But I realized they don't care about public opinion. They don't care what the majority of Americans think. They know that they're not the majority. And in fact, and they've known this for a long time, at least the leaders have. And so, like, for instance, in 1980, there was what the kind of birth of the religious right. Took place at a meeting that Ronald Reagan had with these far-right pastors in Dallas, Texas, that was put together by this guy named Paul Weyrich. And Paul Weyrich had spent his earlier part of his career, creating a number of different far-right groups like American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC. He was also involved he was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation, and he had created some other groups as well and he realized that they couldn't win a presidential election based solely on people who wanted to slash the government. What they needed to do was get the far-right Christians to vote for them and to be aware of what they were doing. And he got up in the speech, and it was a program, and there were, several thousand people there. And he got up and gave a speech, and one of the things that he said in it was that, there are some pastors out there who have what I call the goo-goo syndrome, good government. They want everybody to vote. Well, I don't want everybody to vote. And in fact, quite frankly, the more people are voting, the worse we do in elections. So what we need to do is have fewer people voting so that we can get what we want. And that became kind of the animating principle for this movement going forward. And so while they tell their base voters and tell, the kind of uninformed activists that they represent the silent majority, if you will, they know that they're not the majority. And so once I discovered all, kind of that history and just actually watched the Weyrich speech, and I realized that I couldn't in good conscience publish that book especially because the last part of the book was about how the right wing could use the government policy and other ideas to cement even more power and build it for themselves. And basically, I was like, well, they will ignore the first part of my book, and then and take only the last part of my book to become even worse than they are now. So I can't do this, and I began. So in that realization came at the same time that I was trying to send my draft out of my book to some Christian right people who I thought were my friends, because I wanted them to see it. I wanted them to give me feedback, to say that, well, conservatism actually is all about religion, and here's the proof. Like I asked them, tell me how this is wrong.
Right.
But, and unbeknownst to me, one of them started trying to get me fired after he read my draft. And I had another guy who had invited me to a fellowship program that he directed because he thought my thesis was so great. He wanted to get me paid to write it before the book was published. And then so I was excited and submitted it to there. And then I found out that the people who were on the judging board were Christian fundamentalists. And so needless to say, they were not interested in a book of this nature. And basically, as I was having this sort of intellectual realization, I was also having a career realization. They began canceling me. And it's so hilarious that they talk about themselves as this sort of, persecuted minority. But the people who are persecuted the very most are the moderate Christians who have to deal with these fundamentalists, or the non-religious people or non-Christians who live in an area or an organization where the fundamentalist Christians have sway. And so basically it was kind of like a mutual separation. Eventually I realized that, these people actually are not conservative. They are reactionary, and that they're not about they have this imaginary idea of America, and they think that they want to go back to that, but it never existed. And so what they were going to do is destroy all the great things that America is about, and the unique and wonderful heritage that it has in terms of religious freedom as a historical matter. I mean, one of the other things that I came across was some 18th century Jewish history in the United States, and they were just overjoyed at the separation of church and state that existed in the United States, because for them there was nothing like this in the world. And they said this is and a number of them were telling their family members, you should move here. This is great. You can actually be a Jew and not have to live in the closet. And so like it was, so that's how it was at the time. And the America that the Christian supremacists want to go back to, it never existed.
Right.
And so what they want to do is to make everyone else shut up, is to censor everyone else. And then at the same time, lie and say that they are the victims of censorship, when in fact it's them. And you can see that with what they're doing now in a number of schools and the areas where they do control, trying to censor and ban books. And some of them are even talking about burning books. And unfortunately, I've seen several school districts where right-wing officials have talked about burning books. So, like, it is about censorship, and it is about destroying people's freedom to think and believe as they please.
Yeah, this has been a great conversation. I think it's generated some questions, so we're going to move on and see what questions people have from the audience. First, we got Greg J. asks, how do you get people to leave Mormonism if they aren't even aware that's an option? How can you infiltrate that?
Well, I think Mormonism actually is having a very tough time now compared to even a lot of the other fundamentalist high-demand religions, because the evidence that the Book of Mormon took place at all is overwhelmingly negative. And so, like, that is, I think, the best way to talk to Mormons about their religion is don't get into the various doctrines or don't get into moral questions. Just stick to the facts. And there's two books that they have, the Book of Mormon, which they claim is the story of some ancient Jewish Indians who originally in Mormonism they said that the Native Americans across both North and South America were the descendants of some ancient Jews, but eventually the church officially has distanced itself from that idea. And now, if you look at what they say now, they say that the Native Americans, or the settlers, that they call the Lamanites, were among the ancestors of the American Indian. And but a lot of the average Mormons don't know that this happened, that the church has explicitly curtailed its doctrinal belief. And so that's a very important thing to point out to a Mormon if that's somebody who you're trying to talk to. And the other one is that they have another book called the Book of Abraham, which they claim was based on some ancient papyri that were found in Egypt and delivered to their founder, Joseph Smith. But actually, people found the papyri that were in this book, and they have some reproductions, woodcut reproductions of the hieroglyphs in their scripture. And needless to say, the papyri say nothing at all about Abraham. They say nothing at all about Jews or anything like that. It has nothing to do with him in any way, shape, or form. It's just a traditional Book of the Dead. And the Egyptian religion, I think it was a beautiful, interesting, fascinating religion, and actually extraordinarily humane compared to a lot of other ones. And so it's worth looking at it in its own right. But sticking to the facts and just asking them, okay, so what do you telling them where, getting them to explain to you what is the Book of Abraham? Where's your proof that it's real? And they can't do it. And so those are the two ways that I would encourage people to reach out on that way.
Yeah, so we got a question from Martin W., and I'm curious about this too, because I know you do have a large family. The question is, how do you start a conversation with your family about leaving your religion if you don't believe?
Well, I would say probably it's easiest if you don't live with them. So especially if you're a minor, I definitely would not recommend telling your parents that you don't believe if they are, in this kind of a more fundamentalist mindset. But if you're an adult and you don't live with them, I think that it's best to kind of ease people into it because, to some degree, they actually might have already noticed that you don't believe. So, just maybe dropping some hints here and there, maybe just like poking fun at some absurd televangelist, or, finding some video that you found on the internet that really exposes, this fanatical stupidity, and just laughing at it in front of them, and just see what they say. Or, say, wow, this is so ridiculous. I can't believe that somebody actually believes this nonsense. So, like, for instance, there's a video that I found, and I'll send it to you guys so you can put it in the show notes if you want. But there was a video after Trump lost the 2020 election. There was a woman who went on, I presume it was Facebook, and she started praying to God and Trump interchangeably, as if they were the same being. It was like she would pray sometimes to Trump, and then in one sentence, and then switch over to pray to Jesus in the next one. And like, I think there are a lot of let's say moderate believing people who still nonetheless are intolerant of non-believers, and getting them, and they actually think that their beliefs are rational. So, like, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who are, let's say, maybe generally not fundamentalists, who don't believe in evolution. I mean, it's, when you look at public opinion polls, there's a disturbingly high percentage of Americans who don't think it's real. So maybe, start with something like that.
All right. Well, with that, unfortunately, we're out of time. That concludes Ask an Atheist for this week. Thank you so much for joining us, Matthew.
Pleasure to be here.
This week on our broadcast TV show Free Thought Matters, our guest is the legendary author and freethinker John Irving. His latest book is called The Last Chairlift, and he's a fierce proponent of abortion rights. Here's a preview.
Abortion was allowed beginning in the 1620s. It was permitted through the first trimester. So our founding fathers, those deeply religious separatist Puritans, understood that decision belonged to a pregnant woman and to no one else. It was between the women who were pregnant and the midwives, and the matter was settled. Abortion, if you look at American history and the history of abortion in the United States, many Americans don't know this, but abortion was legal in the United States. For 2 centuries, it was scarcely illegal for 1.
You can see Free Thought Matters on TV stations all across the U.S. and also on our Facebook page and YouTube channels.
And also this week on Free Thought Radio, that can be found at ffrf.org/radio. And Annie, Laurie, and Dan, and speaking with John Watley, author of The Phantom God. You can find out how to hear Free Thought Radio at ffrf/radio. And if you want more information about the Freedom from Religion Foundation, check out our website at www.ffrf.org. If you're a member already, thank you. If not, please join us. See you then, and see you next time on FFRF's Ask an Atheist.